Welcome to the Femininja podcast, which is a 5-part series co-curated by Femnet and womankind worldwide to commemorate 16 Days of Activism 2021. Join us as we explore ways to end impunity for femicide based on the lived experiences and activism of activists working in the global south. My name is Marvel and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today, I am so honored to be here with Dr. Michelle. She says I can call her Michelle. Just say hi before we have you introduce yourself shortly.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Marvel, for inviting me to this important conversation. I'm really glad to be here today.
Please tell us something about yourself as we kick off.
Okay, my name is Michelle Maziwisa. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Dalla Oma Institute at the University of the Western Cape. And I'm also a member of Femnet. And I do some work representing Femnet on the Gender and Trade Coalition, which is part of Femnet's efforts towards feminist trade justice. So I definitely am very passionate about women's rights and advocating for women's issues, both the macroeconomic and also in terms of women's safety and security. It's not only an academic or an advocacy issue. I am a woman myself, so these matters are important to me.
Wow. I'm so looking forward to this discussion. Just a little background on what we'll be discussing. We're looking at the background on International Femicide Remembrance Day, which is marked globally since 2019. International Femicide Remembrance Day speaks directly to 16 Days of Activism's 2021 theme. Its purpose is to stand in solidarity with and demand action and accountability for femicide. So on this day was specifically selected by 6,000 organizations in 186 countries on the margins of the ICPD conference in commemoration of the 1989 Montreal massacre, which was an anti-feminist shooting of 14 women. In 2021, we zero in on the role of WHRDs, who are at the forefront of the discourse on economic justice and rights. They address worsening economic conditions, the lack of access to education and health services, and the growing burden traditionally assigned to women of care for loved ones and communities among them. The WHRDs in question face discrimination, marginalization, racism, patriarchy, and GBV, something we both know, including femicide in the hands of state and non-state actors. This has been exacerbated by COVID-19 with a surge in emergency laws and lockdowns and online forms of violence. So that's a little background, Dr. Michelle, which I know you're very aware of. So to my first question, in what ways does economic injustice and inequality intersect with GBV generally and femicide in particular?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's a loaded question because it speaks not only to GBVF, gender-based violence and femicide, but it also speaks to the economic side of things. What research has shown over the last few years is that there is a strong correlation between poverty among women and the risk and incidence of gender-based violence and femicide. And this is exacerbated by power dynamics between men and women, including the dynamic of financial dependence, which plays an important role in exacerbating gender-based violence. We've heard in different stories, in different cases, where a woman is living with a partner and is financially dependent on him. And when she experiences violence, she's often afraid to leave because she has nowhere else to go and live, or she has no one else to help to provide for her financially. And so she stays. And it goes from a clap to a punch punches and kicks until it gets to the unfortunate death of the woman. And this happens over and over again. So I think that illustrates one of the ways in which financial dependence can lead to femicide. But I want to also maybe just give you some stats to put some context into this, if that's okay.
Okay.
So looking at the South African economy, women in South Africa generally have a higher unemployment rate in comparison to men. They tend to have lower wages. We know that the issue of the wage gap between men and women is not yet resolved. So this contributes to women having less resources than men, and also leads to women having higher levels of poverty. Women also, because of societal prejudice and the fact that families tend to favor getting their sons an education from a young age, getting their sons into higher education and universities, also means that women tend to be left out or left behind in their own academic advancement. And also that translates to the economic opportunities and the employment opportunities that are available to them when they change from being girls to women. So it doesn't just start when they become women, it's something that begins right off the bat. So what this translates to is that women tend to find themselves in precarious work conditions, where because of the lack of education, they tend to get jobs that are seasonal, they tend to get part-time jobs, they get low-paying jobs, and they also get junior roles where they don't earn as much as their male counterparts. And I know I'm generalizing here, but I'd like to maybe in this conversation focus on the vulnerabilities as opposed to looking at every single woman, because we all know women are different and have different experiences, right?
Yeah.
So when we look now at the numbers, what do the numbers say about employment, for example? As of 2020, 32.4% of women compared to 28.3% of men were unemployed. So the unemployment rate of women is higher than that of men. But also within that figure, and I think this speaks to the intersectionality of the vulnerabilities that women experience, is that within this figure, Black African women are more vulnerable within the South African economy because their unemployment rate is significantly higher than white women, for example. So the stats say that Black African women have an unemployment rate of 36.5%, and compared to 8.2% for white women. So that's a large margin. And it partly could be contributed to the fact that there's a significantly higher number of Black African women in South Africa, but it also indicates the fact that the difference in economic opportunities that exist, even racially, right? Although I think as a country, have been working progressively towards both gender equality and racial equality. But the stats are still saying that more needs to be done. And then when we look at female-headed households, the stats show us that 39.2% of female-headed households in South Africa do not have an employed household member. So what does that mean? If almost 40% of female-headed households do not have someone who's employed, it means then that they're relying on either government grants, which don't cover a significant amount of the costs. I mean, the amounts are not that high. And also, it means that there's an increased risk of transactional sex, and there's an increased risk of staying in relationships that may be physically or emotionally harmful to the women because of that dependence that is created by living in poverty. And by not having, a woman will think of, what am I going to feed my children, right? So that puts a lot of women in a difficult position of having to choose between violence being perpetrated against them or making sure that their children have a roof over their heads. And not many women are aware of any services that are provided by the state, because they're also women in those conditions tend to find themselves not educated and not aware of government programs that may be running. And I think that's where civil society organizations come in and play a very important role in that awareness raising. And then finally, I mentioned that women will think of what their children will eat.
Yeah.
The stats also show that 43% of children live with only their mother.
Wow.
So if 40% are living with only their mother and 40% are unemployed and have no employed member in the family, that means that only 60% of the population has someone that is employed living in the home. And that means that the women and the children in those female-headed households are now at financial risk. So you can see that this has rollover effects. It's not just one issue. It all works together and puts women at an even increased risk. So I know I could go on with the stats, but you probably have more questions. But I just wanted to show that, this is not just a conversation that women have because we're talking about this International Remembrance Day. It's facts. It's what's actually happening on the ground, and the numbers tell us what's going on the ground. And so that's why I went a little bit far with the numbers there. But back to you.
I actually like the data because the data is what tells us what exactly is happening. And that data is so depressing, all around it. So you're just thinking to yourself that there's too much intersecting issues. So inequalities are never equal. You can see in the Black community, it's different. In the white community, it's a bit different. So on to my second question. In what ways can public policies focused on the recognition and redistribution of the burden of domestic and care work, how can it encourage more equitable participation in public spaces and decision-making by WHRDs?
Yeah. Okay, so I want to respond to your question in two parts. First, I want to respond in relation to women in general, and then specifically to women human rights defenders.
Yeah.
Okay, so currently I'm doing research on local government, actually on multi-level government systems. So for example, in Kenya, you have the Kenyan government, and then you have counties, which illustrates that there's governance at two levels, the national level and the county level. In South Africa, similarly, although it's not exactly the same, we have governance at three levels: the national level, the provincial level, and the local government level. So the Constitution gives each of these levels of government what we call spheres, because they are technically equal. The Constitution gives them each certain powers that they are responsible for, which cannot be taken by another sphere of government. And the Constitution also requires that each of the three spheres of government, the national, provincial, and local, work together and maintain good intergovernmental relations. So they must maintain good relations among themselves. They must communicate, they must support each other, and there's monitoring and supervision mechanisms as well. So why I'm talking about this distinction of power is that in the discourse on women's rights and gender-based violence and femicide and security of the woman, usually the conversation is centered on the national government. Yes. Because the national government is the one that makes commitments under international law, right? So the national government is the one that ratifies, for example, the CEDAW Treaty or the Maputo Protocol and so forth. That happens at the national level. To some extent with participation of, in South Africa's case, the National Council of Provinces, which is the provincial level. But what we find also is that there are a lot of areas of governance that are within the constitutional mandate or the responsibility of local government, which places local government at a central position to influence gender-based violence and femicide. and to influence security of women in general.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
In the South African context, the provision of water, household water reticulation, and
Mm-hmm.
sanitary services is a mandate of the local government. It's a responsibility of local government.
Yeah.
Although we know funding, part of the funding is comes through intergovernmental transfers from the national to the local, but the mandate itself is the local government mandate for service delivery.
Yeah.
So in this context, the provision of water, running water in taps, then is the responsibility of local government. The provision of toilets is also then the responsibility of local government. And I'm going somewhere with this.
Yes.
Bear with me.
That's fine.
So I want to give you an example of a case where the city of Cape Town had decided to construct toilets in a high density informal settlement area. Some would call them shacks or shanty towns. I know it differs in different countries, but they were supposed to construct these toilets, and they got into an agreement with the province, the Western Cape province, to partner in this effort. Mm-hmm. But something happened and there was miscommunication between the province and the local government, such that the toilets were constructed, but the problem was the toilets were constructed with only the toilet that you sit on and the flusher and the sink with no. So there were no walls around the toilet. The toilets were not enclosed.
Are you serious?
Yes, and I know that's a nervous laugh because this really actually happened in real life.
For real.
For real.
Okay.
So after this happened, and millions were spent on this project, and then the city and the province said that their job was done. They had constructed the toilets, and the confusion also came in that the city tried to, or rather came to an agreement, unlawfully of course, with residents, or maybe let me not say unlawfully, let me say mistakenly. They erroneously came to an agreement with community members because they were, the idea is they construct toilets for a certain number of households. Mm-hmm. But then other households decided that if they construct more toilets, then they can put their own enclosures. So that's the agreement, in theory, that was there. But of course, that's not really a wise agreement for a city to have with communities. Because in reality, what happened is not all households were able to provide those closures. Yeah. And the toilets, most of which were constructed along the road where there's traffic. So what people would do in that community until this issue was resolved was people would take a blanket and go to this open toilet and cover themselves with a blanket and relieve themselves. But remember, this is on the street. Yes. And there were cases where women were attacked. There was an old woman who was attacked while using this toilet. It's an open toilet, basically, with just a blanket. But what it does is it essentially put women at risk because women had to use this unsafe open toilet in the full view of everyone walking and everyone driving past and everyone who lives in the surrounds of the toilet. And so the point I'm trying to put across is that cities have an important role to play in their spatial planning. When cities plan how a place is going to be used, when cities plan how to construct and provide basic services, they can affect the risk. They can either increase or reduce the risk that women face in terms of their safety. And the same applies to the provision of water. When there is when there are no taps within the home, it means women have to walk a longer distance to try and access taps, publicly provided taps or standpipes or tanks to get water. And there have been several reports of violence against women perpetrated in those circumstances. Cities also have a role to play with regards to street lighting. They have a role to play with regards to the availability and frequency of public transportation. If public transport systems do not work, then women are at more risk if they're working and they have to leave the home early or come back late. So all of those things are issues that are within the local government responsibility in our context, and not only the national government. So that's why I'm flagging it. It's really unfortunate. It just shows you the impacts of inequality, right? Because the women in those communities have no other choice. Those are the toilets that they have access to.
Yeah, so I thought that was very unfortunate. I was thinking, oh my goodness, what kind of project is that? It's like it's doomed to fail even before it starts. And it's an economic gap because you assume all the families around there are, and especially because most of them are women-headed families, you assume that they all have money to do it. And it's very expensive. Somebody has to choose between food and sending a child to school, plus now doing the toilet. Yeah.
Oh, wow. And it just shows you as well why it's important to have women represented in local and provincial government. Because I can imagine that because of the experience of being woman, when you're faced with making certain decisions, certain considerations come to your mind. You will think about, okay, so how is a woman going, and I'm going to make this a little bit too much information, but just to make it graphic enough for it to make sense. If you were a woman sitting in local council when this decision was passed, you would probably consider, how is a woman going to put a blanket over her head while she is menstruating and changing her sanitary wear and also holding the blanket up? I don't think a man would ordinarily consider something like that because it's not something that they experience. And so it's important for representative democracy to make sure that there are enough women represented on council, and that those women that are represented, that are on council, are actually empowered to understand and to know how to articulate these issues and how to follow them through in terms of policy decisions and resource allocation to address these issues.
Very true. So on to one question, and you can be as elaborate as you need to be, because I know we've already tackled some. What measures can decision makers and state actors institute to strengthen accountability for femicide as we mark the International Femicide Remembrance Day?
Okay, thank you for that question. And I think I will tie it back into the second part of the last question. You had also asked me about women human rights defenders specifically. So now in my first response, I was looking at the local government level. Now I want to take it to the national level. Like I said, the powers are separated to the different spheres. So in South Africa, the national government is responsible it has shared powers with the provinces on issues of international trade and on issues of environmental protection. But the national government essentially makes the final decisions when it comes to foreign investments that are being made in the country, right? Which is logical because it's a foreign interest. So if I can look at it from the perspective of foreign direct investment in the extractive sector, I think this is where we find women human rights defenders facing perhaps the highest risk of violence and femicide in this sector, where women human rights defenders work with communities to protect their environmental rights and to advocate for the protection of those rights against the superpowers, as it were, of large transnational corporations that are operating in the country. So for as long as, I don't know, since time immemorial, there's always been a conflict between the interests of foreign investors, which primarily invest with a profit motive, and the interests of national governments and communities, usually, or actually, let me separate it for purposes of this discussion. The aims of national governments are usually to promote economic growth, which I would distinguish from economic development. So economic growth, you could say, looks at issues of employment creation, increasing the gross domestic product, and so forth. So the interest of investors is to make a profit. The interests of government are to boost employment creation, and have more industries and generate more revenue so that people can save more money and grow the economy. And then the interests of local communities are usually different in a sense. So local communities, yes, they want jobs, but they also want to have a clean and a safe environment. They also want to have access to water that is not harmful to their health, that is not polluted, for example, with mercury or other harmful chemicals that come out of the mining process. And they also want to be able to preserve their culture and the food systems that exist within the areas where they live. So women human rights defenders will usually come to the aid of those local communities who find themselves in areas where there is foreign direct investment in mining, for example, in those areas. So the problem now is that for a long time, there have been reports that strange things happen to women human rights defenders because they get targeted. And because it's not always easy to pinpoint who has done it, but reports in the help us to see that if you trace some of the disappearances and some of the murders of women human rights defenders are usually associated to women that have been advocating strongly against a particular mining company or against a particular contract being concluded and that sort of thing. So I think that's where the national government has a crucial role to play. It has a crucial role to play because the government, the national government, is the one that has the responsibility to respect, protect, and promote women's human rights based on its international commitments, right? So the national government has to put in place not only policy to protect women, but also laws and make sure that those laws are enforced. But law enforcement on its own is not sufficient. There's also a need to have the relevant, accessible institutions that, firstly, that enforce those laws, and secondly, that are accessible to women in general and women human rights defenders specifically, to be able to get help when they find themselves or their lives threatened in those situations. And then the other thing is, not only does the national government itself have a responsibility, but even the corporations have a responsibility, because businesses have a duty to respect human rights. But we know that businesses operate for a profit. So if the government doesn't hold them to account, if the government doesn't ask certain things of them, then they can get away scot-free. If the government doesn't take into account, for example, reports, say by specialized institutions like the South African Human Rights Commission, which has written on issues like this, if those things are not taken into account and used to reform the law around the protection of women human rights defenders, then the conversation will continue and nothing will change. So the government still has an important role to play in that regard. I think that's probably all I can say for now. And
Thank you. I can see three things coming up. We need to deliberately have women put in power, because if there's something that the director for Feminet always says, he always tells us, all of us, that whatever is not counted is not accountable. If you're not accountable, you're not counted. So either way, if you're not counted, you're not going to matter. Your voice won't matter. The budgets won't cover you. There's need, like I can hear you saying that we need law enforcement to be responsible, to hold organizations, to hold corporates responsibly, to make sure that they do the right thing, and that law enforcement is not enough if the organizations, there's no, you know how you can say, okay, so we've left it to the local government to enforce it. So if you don't particularly point somebody, you are the one, the specific person or the specific department, you are supposed to enforce this, it won't work. And then I'm hearing about accountability. We need a lot of people held accountable. Yeah. Do you have any last words? Any last few words?
I'm always tempted to speak about trade because that comes very close to my heart.
Okay.
So, I mean, we know that right now the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is in force, and it's supposed to create increased opportunities for women to take part in the broader African economy. But at the moment, it seems it's only speaking to having women more involved, but the actions seem to show that it's leaning more towards being neutral. And we find a lot of trade agreements tend to be neutral. They're framed as if they're neutral, but their impacts are actually gendered. So where am I going with this? As trade is going to increase under this agreement, there are going to be increased opportunities for women, but also increased risks where women's livelihoods are going to be at stake to some extent. So when we say we're opening up trade, we're basically saying that we're making it easier to trade or to buy and sell goods and services across borders from one country to another. And what this translates to in some ways is that it's going to be easier for producers from other countries to import into your country. So for example, to import into Kenya or to import into South Africa. And when more goods are available, more goods are produced. Let's say they're importing flowers or coffee into Kenya, right? When more coffee is being imported into Kenya, that means the coffee that's already produced in Kenya is going to have more coffee produced, and then there's going to be too much coffee, or a lot of coffee rather, in the Kenyan market. And what does that do? It puts the prices lower. It pushes the prices down because of competition. So what that means for women is that if you have any small scale women producers or women-owned farms or women working within the farms, it means that when they sell their products, they're going to have to compete with producers, with international producers, basically. They're going to have to compete with producers from other countries. And the prices, as soon as the price of the final product goes down, it also means that their profits from selling those goods are going to go down, which means that women's income in those sectors, and a majority of women are working in the farming sector in most African countries, I think about 70%. So if the prices of goods go down and women's income goes down, that's going to put women at an increased risk of economic dependence. And again, at an increased risk of economic dependence on men and transactional sex. So these are things that we're going to have to look out for. And similarly, when we have more investors coming in from other countries to invest and produce in our countries, it's not only in mining, but women human rights defenders are going to find themselves at the forefront of many human rights violations advocacy, because we know that businesses are capable of harming human rights. So that also puts women human rights defenders at the forefront of risk. So our governments really need to think carefully about this. The agreement was entered into very fast. There are provisions that they're negotiating on, for example, e-commerce and trade and services, which will include people being able to cross borders. And that also increases the risk of human trafficking and so forth. So there's really so much that we need to look out for and keep our ears to the ground and train our African women so that we're not put further at risk. And I think maybe I can end off with that.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate this. I know that a lot of these economic partnership agreements have a lot of gaps. that people need to, especially governments, that they need to seal them. As we say in Kenya, asante sana. It means thank you very much. We really, really, yes. We are so grateful that you were able to talk to us about femicide and women, economic justice and rights. I have really learned a lot. I know the audience will also learn a lot. This is very eye-opening, and especially for governments also to think through their decisions. We really appreciate that you graced us with your presence. I know next time when we are discussing this, we're going to be better for it because of having you in the studio. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marvel. I really enjoyed speaking with you. I'm sure you can see that there's a lot to be done. There's a lot of work. So so I think my encouragement to you is to keep on with the hard work. Don't give up. There's a lot of work, and we're looking forward to seeing more of what you're doing and sharing it with our communities here. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Okay.
Thanks. Bye-bye.